Hello, Jeff Zwerink here, and welcome to the segment of 2819, where we get to take a deeper dive into the scholarly literature. And today we're going to talk about the flood. What are the scientific evidences for it? How as Christians do we think about that? Joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Hugh Ross. So let's get started. Hugh, there's as Christians talk about the flood, everybody agrees there was a flood of some sort.
Talk about Noah's flood, right?
We're talking about Noah's flood, yes. There's a discussion of whether the flood covered the entire earth and what sort of physical implications did that have. So before we start, just give us a brief description of what RTB's position is on the flood. And we're talking about 30 seconds here. So.
Okay, 2 Peter 2:5. The world of ungodly people was wiped out by the flood. So it's the entire extent of Earth's surface where human beings were living. Not the whole globe, just that part of the earth where humans, ungodly humans, and the animals bonded to them were living.
Okay, so we're talking, so that in that there's this critical part of that model is that humanity had not extended to cover the whole earth, because if that was the case, then the flood will be global, correct?
Right.
But so we're some smaller region than the entire earth, but the flood extended to that whole region where humanity and everything that it impacted was wiped out.
Every human and all their animals were wiped out except for those on board the ark.
Okay, so one question that would come up in that, what sort of extent are we talking about there?
Well, I believe the flood happened during the last ice age.
Okay.
That's because of how long the biblical text tells us that the water receded, which means there had to be a huge amount of melting snow and ice to explain why it took a whole year for the waters to recede.
Okay, so just before we move on there, flesh that out a little bit. Bible says it takes on the order of a year for the flood waters to recede. Why does that require an ice age to make that happen?
Well, the longest flood we know of in recent times was the Mississippi Valley about a quarter of a century ago,
okay,
where it was flooded for 4 months, 50 feet deep, the Mississippi Valley. But that was a year when we had a huge amount of snow melt off of the Canadian and American Rockies. And so the water that was flowing out into the Gulf of Mexico was being replaced by fresh water from snow melt. Well, likewise, the water that would be flowing out of the Middle Eastern region into the Indian Ocean, that was being replaced by the melting of snow and ice in the mountainous and hill regions around that. But it's also a time when the sea level was 300 or 400 below what it is right now. So it changes the geography of the flood. Mm-hmm. It's much more than just the Mesopotamian plain. That would be a time when the Persian Gulf was dry land. So the Persian Gulf is flooded, the Mesopotamian plain is flooded, large chunks of what are now Iran and Saudi Arabia would have been flooded. It's really quite a large flood, and explains why, given the geography that existed in the days of the last ice age, you could have a flood extensive enough that it wipes out all of humanity.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about a flood that extensive, I mean, one thing that is true is the higher the water level, the faster it runs out. So to flood that entire region, you got to be pretty high in you got to have a fairly deep flood to cover all of that region. Well, so the waters have to be pretty high. So they're going to be flowing out pretty quickly. How do you take a year to drain that?
Well, again, what we see during the last ice age, there were short episodes of dramatic warming. Even though ice was there would be periods when it would be, literally thousands of feet thickness of ice would be melting in a short period of time. So when you got that quantity of ice being melted that fast, yes, even with a flood that's, say, 400 feet deep, you can replace the water that's flowing out into the ocean.
Okay, and so this is kind of an interesting way to look at it, because effectively what you're saying is that the length of time described in the Bible actually provides us input in how to go look at the conditions that are going around, the conditions are going on. Why could this not just be a global flood where it takes a year and a half for the waters to settle back into the underground aquifers? What keeps that explanation from being a good one?
Well, we have no geological evidence for a flood that big. I mean, if the flood was global, and basically the global flood people believe in the global flood, they have to find some way to change the geology where you don't have as much relief, and the relief pops up during the receding.
So just to make sure, relief is mountains and valleys. That's
Right.
you're talking about texture to the surface of the earth. if
Like
you will.
right now, we got 70,000 feet of difference in height and depth, if you include the oceans
Right.
and the highest mountains. And in order to have a global flood, you need to have that a lot less, which also means that with the receding of the waters, all that vertical tectonic movement needs to happen. And the global flood models I've also looked at basically have a supercontinent that splits up during the 1 year. The problem with all those models is way too much tectonic activity to squeeze into a 5-month period. And if you actually look at the energy release from all the tectonics you would need to have a global flood, it's enough to evaporate all the water in the face of the earth. And clearly the text doesn't permit that.
Well, okay, so let's investigate that claim for just a second. Because so what you're saying is, in a global flood model, typically all the continents are in one place, and the mountains and valleys are much less because there's just a limited quantity of water here on the
Right,
earth, and to
right.
be able to cover it, that's the constraint you have. So you're saying that in order to get from that situation to something that akin to what we see today, where there are 5 or 30,000 foot mountains, big troughs, all that sort of stuff. To do that, the tectonic activity would vaporize all the water on the earth. Kind of explain how that flows out, because it just seems like tectonic activity means things are moving across the surface of the earth.
Well, I mean, you and I have been through tectonic plate movements where you get 2 inches of movement, and it's quite destructive. I remember one such earthquake that damaged all of our furniture, and it was only 2 inches of plate tectonic movement. Multiply that up to 5,000 miles of plate tectonic movement. That's horizontal movement. And you mentioned 70,000 feet of vertical movement. I mean, we're not just talking magnitude 9 earthquakes.
Okay, so it's not, I mean, instead of just getting sounds, just the physical movement is going to generate a lot of kinetic energy in the earth, and that's what's
A
going to
lot of kinetic
very
energy.
good.
That's what's going to vaporize the water. That's what's going to kill all life on the face of the earth.
So these global flood models have problems in terms of where do you get all the water, how do you get the tectonic relief, how do you not vaporize the oceans while that.
And you got to get the Arctic to survive. Look at the tsunamis you're going to have.
That's a fair point. There are some challenges with those.
Right.
So let's RTB has a local flood model, and I hesitate to use that because most
I
people
prefer the word universal.
I got that, because there's this distinction. It's a local flood, but it's a very large flood, and it extends to all of humanity. And
It wipes out all of humanity except those on the ark.
So is there scientific evidence for a flood like that?
Well, there is evidence that there's an enormous aquifer underneath the Persian Gulf. And so I believe that probably Noah was building the ark in what's called the Persian Gulf oasis, which would have been dry land during the last ice age. And the text tells us that water came up from the deep. So something happened tectonically that caused all that water below to come up to the surface. You got torrential rain coming down for 40 days and 40 nights. There's actually some geological evidence of a berm at the Gulf of Hormuz. And if that berm were to break, that would cause a rush of ocean water to come into those regions. And then you got the melting of huge amounts of ice and snow off of the mountains and hills around there. So I see 4 distinct sources of water, sufficient sources of water that we could actually conceive of wiping out all of humanity except for those on board the ark, but distributed enough that we would expect the people on board the ark to survive.
So there's lots of processes that are going in there, but that's also something unique that you wouldn't expect to happen frequently or very often or maybe even ever again, which points to its miraculous nature as well.
To me, what makes it miraculous, they're happening simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Yes, these 4 events could happen independent of one another. The fact that they all happen at the same time and of sufficient magnitude to actually wipe out all of humanity, except for those on board the ark, and ensure that those on board the ark actually survive these 4 simultaneous events.
Well, that is pretty important. I thank you for your comments, Hugh. Christians do argue quite a bit about whether the flood was global or local and what's the evidence for this, that, and even skeptics look and say, the idea that a flood wiped out all of humanity, that can't happen. But there are ways, when you look carefully at what the text says, when you look at what the scientific data points to, you can build a model where there is this flood that wipes out all of humanity, that causes this catastrophic destruction in a local region, that wipes out all of humanity, and yet recedes in just the way it's talked about. And it also points to the miraculous nature of God using it for his purposes. And so what we find is that as we look at what Scripture says and what creation says, we find that they line up. And that gives us good reason to believe that the God of the Bible is the God who created the universe.